Welcome to EduRev.
Welcome students, I'm Clarice Pereira Colasso and I have been training NEET medical aspirants in botany and zoology as well as NCERT based board exams for the past 8 years. We have already completed a little bit about reproduction in organisms in the previous 2 video lectures. In other words, we have actually finished about asexual reproduction. In today's lecture, we are going to study sexual reproduction in organisms. So today's overview is going to be an introduction to sexual reproduction as well as what are the different stages in the life cycle of a sexually reproducing organism. Now, to start off with an introduction on sexual reproduction, obviously we know that sexual reproduction requires two gametes to fuse together, and there are four important characteristics that we must consider. The first characteristic is, obviously, if you want gametes to fuse, you must have the formation of the male and the female gamete. However, male and female gametes can be formed in two different ways. For example, both gametes can be formed within or in the same individual, or you can form them using two different individuals, in other words, two opposite sexes. Now, in the first case, if an individual forms both gametes, you will call that particular organism as bisexual, in other words, male as well as female gamete generated in the same organism. In other words, both organs exist over there, both reproductive organs. However, when we say that they're produced in different individuals of opposite sex, we imply that we have unisexual organisms, so a separate male and a separate female. So this is the first characteristic of a sexually reproducing organism. The second is you have to have fusion of these particular gametes, implying the moment gametes start fusing, you will form a zygote. So the zygote will be diploid, okay? And this particular zygote generally diploid, but later on we will study some haploid forms, okay? Zygotes converting into haploid forms. But when gametes fuse, you will have a zygote, and this particular zygote should develop into an offspring. The third characteristic, sexual reproduction as compared to asexual, okay, sexual reproduction is said to be very elaborate, very complex, and an absolutely slow process. Now, what do we imply by that? Why do we say sexual reproduction is elaborate? First of all, for sexual reproduction, you have to spend a lot of time in developing the sexual organs of that particular individual. Furthermore, those particular organs must undergo gametogenesis. In other words, they must form gametes. This particular gamete formation is very complex. That's why we say complexity. Okay, now why is it complex? It involves meiosis. Meiosis has crossing over, so that is a very complicated process. Okay, and finally it is a very slow process. Now, why do we say sexual reproduction is slow? First of all, a sexually reproducing organism must enter a mature phase in order to carry out reproduction. Secondly, once the gametes are produced, the gametes must be transferred. After they are transferred, they must fuse. In other words, fertilization must take place. That particular zygote must grow into an adult individual, or rather say a fetus, and then an offspring, and that particular offspring must grow into a fully grown individual. So it is a very slow process as compared to asexual reproduction. So elaborate, complex, as well as slow. And finally, the fourth characteristic of sexual reproduction is that the offspring produced from sexual reproduction are never identical to one another, nor are they identical to their parent. For example, you probably have siblings. Your sibling is not identical to you unless you have an identical twin. But otherwise speaking, your sibling is not identical to you, nor is your sibling identical to either of your parents. Now, why does this particular occurrence take place? In sexual reproduction, when gametes fuse, the male gamete from the father and the female gamete from the mother, okay, when they fuse together, a lot of variations are induced in that particular zygote. And let's say the zygote that gives rise to the first sibling and the zygote that gives rise to the second sibling have a variety of different variations. So the variation selected will be different for different individuals. Now, why does this occur? Remember that when the gametes are formed during meiosis, and meiosis has a lot of selection processes. It has crossing over, which means a variety of changes and combinations can take place during meiosis. Furthermore, once that egg and once that sperm is formed, during fertilization, it is a very random process. For example, in case of humans, one egg is given out every month by the female, but a million sperms are approaching that particular egg. Now it's just a question of a matter of chance, you will understand later why, that one of those sperms will fuse with the egg. So automatically, maybe say if sperm number one fused with the egg, you would get certain type of variations, but if sperm number two fused with the egg, you would get a different form of variation. So therefore fusion results in variation. So again, the four characteristics of sexual reproduction are: number one, you need to form gametes; number two, these gametes must fuse to give rise to the zygote; number three, sexual reproduction on the whole is very elaborate, it's complex, it's going to be very, very slow as compared to asexual reproduction; and finally, when we speak about sexual reproduction, we must expect that variations are going to occur in the individuals, and they are not exact and identical cloned copies of their parent nor of themselves. Now, what are the stages of life in a sexually reproducing organism? In other words, from life to death in the lifespan of a sexually reproducing organism, what should we expect to find? Now, there are three phases that you will find here. The first is called the juvenile phase or the vegetative phase. The word juvenile gives you an understanding of maybe childhood, juvenile. The second is the reproductive phase. So in case of humans, you can understand maybe say adolescence and adulthood. And finally, senescence phase is old age, another word for old age. Now, a transition between these three stages, okay, normally takes place because of changes in hormones. For example, let's take a human male. When you speak about a human male, let's say a young boy, okay, from the age of 0 to say around 12, till the testes start functioning and producing testosterone, that means from 0 to 12, there's hardly any, or rather, there is no testosterone. So at that particular time, you will say that the boy is behaving like a child, okay? So childhood, juvenile phase, there is no testosterone. But the moment he starts producing testosterone, so that means the testes start becoming functional, okay, you will say that he has entered a reproductive phase. So the testosterone hormone defined a transition between juvenile and reproductive phase, okay. So transition between all three stages depend upon hormones. Now we are going to study all these three stages in depth. The first one, the juvenile or the vegetative stage. So if you take a human being, for example, juvenile means childhood, okay? So it's the early part of your lifespan. So it is a period from your birth to sexual maturity. For example, in that young boy from 0 to say around 12 or 13 years, still the testes produces ample amount of testosterone and you have sperm generation in the male. That would be the juvenile phase. Now, I wanted to think a little bit about it. When you speak about this young boy, during his juvenile phase, okay, obviously it is marked by rapid growth, okay. You would see the child increasing in height. So physical growth, apart from physical growth, so you can say physical maturity, you will have mental maturity coming in, and as you start developing, also sexual maturity will develop in the reproductive organs. So therefore juvenile phase accounts for certain amount of growth in the body in terms of mass, okay, as well as maturity in terms of physical maturity, reproductive maturity, as well as certain degree of mental maturity. Finally, depending on the organism, okay, this particular time of juvenile phase can be variable. For example, for humans it's around 12 years, but maybe for other organisms like dogs and cats it is way lesser. So it depends on the organism or the species that we are considering. The next is the reproductive phase. Now, when do you say a person has entered a reproductive phase? So the moment you transit from the juvenile, you now enter the reproductive. So the end of the juvenile implies the beginning of the reproductive. Okay. Now we're going to study reproductive phases separately for plants and separately in case of animals. Now, before we go into that, reproductive phases, okay, or reproduction is very closely associated with interactions between two things, okay. The first is interaction between hormones and interaction with the environment. Now what do we mean by that? Very clearly, the reproductive processes, let's say in human beings, the behaviors that that human beings express largely depend on the amount of hormone that you have. For example, lesser amount of testosterone would imply that the man is not very active. More amount would make him very sexually active. Okay, so this is with regards to hormones. But when we speak about other organisms, not really humans, but other organisms, apart from hormones, Hormones also cause reproductive processes and certain behavioral expressions in them. But apart from hormones, the environment plays a very major role. For example, if you have seasonal breeders, for example, certain types of rabbits and let's say reindeer, they are seasonal breeders. Okay, so in a particular season, you will find that the testosterone level is very high, and that particular level would be accompanied with good environmental conditions that would help them to mate. Okay, so in case of other organisms, other animals, generally speaking, hormones and environmental factors play a very important role together. Okay, for certain reproductive processes and for certain behaviors that they express. Now, coming to reproduction in plants. So we said that we're going to study them separately. Okay, so when we study reproduction in plants, first of all, let us try to understand lifespans of plants. Okay, so we can divide plants into those that have shorter lifespans and those that have longer lifespans. Now, generally speaking, plants with shorter lifespans, you can put them in two categories. One is called as an annual and the other is called as a biennial. Now, what is the difference between these two? When we speak about an annual, this is a plant that completes its lifespan in just one season. Now, what do we mean by that? From seed to death, which means seed has to germinate, it has to grow, it has to flower, it has to fruit, and then it has to die. Okay, so from seed to death, okay, should be completed in one growing season. Maybe let's say the rainy season. Okay, so in one entire season, this particular plant lives and dies. That's an annual. But a biennial, the word bi, telling you that two should be involved. Now, what do you mean by two here? It completes its lifespan, so seed to death, in two growing seasons. So maybe let's say the rainy season, maybe say a little bit of the winter. Okay. Now, these are plants with short lifespans, everything occurring within a year, so to say. But if we consider the plant that has a long lifespan, this is called as a perennial, coming from the word perennial, rivers, always flowing. Okay. Now, these are plants that live for many years together. For example, a mango tree, it can live for a number of years together. Okay. So these are plants that live for longer periods of time, much, much longer. Now, the question here is, why have we taken these lifespans of plants? We want to understand whether transition from juvenile to reproductive and senescence can be observed in all of them very clearly. For example, since plants like annuals and biennials grow within a year, okay, so one or two growing seasons, it's very easy to observe all the stages of life of the sexually reproducing plant. Okay, so that is juvenile, reproductive, as well as senescence. You can observe it in these two. However, in a perennial, that's a problem. Since you do not know how long that plant is going to live, you may at the most observe maybe say juvenile and at the most certain amount of the reproductive, but you do not know when that particular plant is going to die. So you will not be able to observe probably the third phase, the senescence phase. So it is difficult to observe all the stages in a perennial plant, but it's easy to observe them in annuals and in biennials. So this is important to remember. Now, there are two very important perennial species that we must study. The first is bamboo and the second is Strobilanthus kuntia, which is also called as Nilakuranji. That's the general term that is used. Okay, now why is it important? These are perennial plants, but they flower after a very, very long time. Okay, for example, bamboo will flower once maybe in 50 to 100 years. Okay, and after that it's going to die. So it will flower, it will produce huge amounts of fruit, after which it will die. Now, one very important, or rather one amazing concept is with regards to Nilakuranji. Now, this particular plant will flower once in 12 years, okay, and it generally flowers maybe around September to October, okay. Now, the last time that at least your NCRT textbook or most of your reference books will give you is in the year 2006. However, if you count 12 years from then, it did flower again in the year 2018. Okay, so you need to remember that particular concept. Now, where do you find Nilakuranji growing? They're found in the hilly areas of Tamil Nadu, Kerala and Karnataka. Okay, and this is a very beautiful flower. It's a purplish blue color flower. So when it flowers, it attracts a lot of tourists. The hills are no longer green, but they look a purplish blue, something like this. So this was Nilakuranji in the year 2018. Okay, now let's move on to the next type of next type of reproductive phase, that is in case of animals. Now, reproductive behavior in animals obviously is associated with morphological and physiological changes. For example, when a male is becoming reproductively active, you will definitely see secondary sexual characteristics, so morphological external features changing, as well as physiological features. That means internally the body mechanism is also going to change, testosterone is going to increase. Likewise, in case of human females, you will see morphological changes. You will see the formation of secondary sexual characteristics, like even the tone of voice and the breast in case of females. And you will also have the menstrual cycle starting in case of human females. That's a physiological change. Okay. Now, when animals breed, animals can be classified into two categories. One is a seasonal breeder and the other is a continuous breeder. Now, from the terms itself, it's very easy to understand. A seasonal breeder will breed in a particular season only, but a continuous breeder can breed throughout the year. Now, very clearly, if you try to place human beings here, we know that human beings fall into continuous breeders. Okay, we can breed, or in other words, you can have offspring throughout the year. But let's focus a little bit on seasonal breeders. Okay, so seasonal breeders are animals, especially those living in nature, in which wild conditions exhibit reproductive cycles only during favorable seasons. So only during the favorable season you will have these reproductive cycles coming in. Whereas continuous breeders, these animals are reproductively active throughout the year. Okay, so therefore called as continuous breeders. Now we're going to focus a little bit on seasonal breeding. Now, an example of a seasonal breeder are birds, okay, for example, poultry. But we can argue here and we can say that poultry give rise to eggs throughout the year, yet we are calling them seasonal. Seasonal would mean only in one season we should get eggs, but we are able to get eggs throughout the year. Now, how is that happening? We are able to captive breed. Okay, we are able to breed these particular birds under captivity. It's not a natural condition. So when we define seasonal breeding, we are defining it very specifically for natural wild conditions. However, in captivity, we can make the same organism which was supposed to be a seasonal breeder, we can make it become a continuous breeder. Now, coming to different types of animals. Okay, now we have a large category of animals. I'm sure you've studied animal kingdom. Now we're going to focus only on placental mammals, and that too, two very specific categories of placental mammals, one being a non-primate and the other being a primate. Okay, so your primates are your monkeys, apes, humans. Non-primates are things like cats, dogs, cows. Okay, now in both of them you have a kind of cyclic process taking place. Okay, in case of primates we call it as a menstrual cycle, but in case of non-primates you will call it as an estrous cycle. Now, we should be a little familiar with the menstrual cycle since we're human beings, okay? But let's try to understand what is an estrous cycle with respect to a menstrual cycle. So let's take some distinction points. So in a menstrual cycle, we know that once every month the female sheds the endometrium. The endometrium is the inner lining or the blood lining of the uterus. So bleeding occurs once every month. It's a cyclic process because it's occurring once every month. But in an estrous cycle, there is no such bleeding. There is no such shedding of the endometrium, shedding of the uterus lining. The second, females that exhibit a menstrual cycle do not exhibit unusual sexual surges only during the release of the blood lining, which means during menstruation, she is not sexually very active. Okay, she's sexually active throughout. However, in an estrous cycle, when the female enters that particular phase of the estrous cycle, you will see an unusual sexual urge in the female. Okay, that is called as the period of her heat, during which she has ovulation, so she desires sexual intercourse. Now, menstrual cycle, copulation or sexual intercourse is not restricted to any time of the cycle. You can have a sexual intercourse at any point of time. But in the estrous cycle, copulation is preferred during the period of heat. Now, why is that so? Because this is around the time you have ovulation. Okay, so the female desires to have sexual intercourse so that ovulation and sexual intercourse are together and you would have a high probability of having offspring. So this is the difference between menstrual cycle and the estrous cycle. Now coming to the last phase, that is senescence or old age. Okay, now obviously we can say end of the reproductive phase should demarcate the onset of old age. But there's a small problem with this. Many females undergo menopause, okay, which is the end of menstrual cycle or rather menstruation, maybe say even at the age of 40. Now, would you call a human female old at the age of 40? Definitely not. She's she's quite young still. Okay, so this is just one parameter. The end of the reproductive phase, transiting to the old age phase or senescence phase, is just one parameter. Apart from that, we have other parameters. Now, what are the other parameters that define senescence? The one is change in morphology and physiology of the body. Now, apart from end of reproductive phase, I want you to think about it. Definitely, as a person starts getting older, you will see morphological changes. For example, shortening of height, okay, wrinkles on the face, you start losing your eyesight, okay, all of those type of things. And physiological changes of the body. Now, what do you mean by physiological changes? Internal body changes. You will find that as the person grows older, you start having a lot of erratic problems in terms of physiology, heart conditions, BP problems, okay. So all of this is an indicator of the beginning of senescence, onset of senescence. So physiological changes start taking place, and you have an overall slowing of body metabolism. Okay, now for example, obviously your grandparents are not as quick as you. Okay, you are much quicker simply because your metabolic processes are also much faster, much more efficient as compared to your older grandparents. So this is the senescent phase. Okay, so and overall we have gone through three phases of a sexually reproducing organism: the juvenile, that is your vegetative phase, the reproductive phase, and finally the senescence phase. So students, I invite you to go through the ample amount of material, tests, and other videos that we have in EduRev Infinity. And I'm sure by going through this, it will help you increase your nationwide ranking, and I'm sure you're going to do very, very well in your NEET exam. Thank you.